The role of the anxiety emotional intelligence is to prevent the stimuli from the anxiety pole to get to the consciousness. So the role of the anxiety emotional intelligence is to do the same thing as the primary psychosis does, which is to open the umbrella over consciousness to protect it from the anxiety. The goal is the same, but the performance is different. The primary psychosis blocks the access of anxiety to the human consciousness without any mental effort. Is given to the man by the nature. Meanwhile, our consciousness must acquire anti-anxiety tools throughout our life, because these are the tools of the consciousness, and thanks to them, the consciousness becomes the subject in the fight against the anxiety and not an object when the subject in the fight against the anxiety is the primary psychosis. And this is why many people prefer the constant and arduous effort of consciousness that will empower them to fight with the anxiety rather than the donated bliss of no anxiety, but at the cost of objectifying the consciousness. But the fair price of being a subject that the consciousness pays, like the price of any subjectivity, is very high. Is it worth paying it? There are two different answers to these questions, and both are correct. Type 1 humanity, psychotic, does not have to pay the price of subjectivity. And it's not at all the type 1 humanity does not want the subjective consciousness. It's not at all that the type 1 humanity does not want the subjective consciousness. Because whether we belong to one or the other humanity is not the result of a child's conscious pursuit. It's not possible to pursue it consciously, as already in the childhood you can strive consciously to acquire further intellectual or physical skills. This is none of these endeavors. Until the end of childhood, it's impossible to predict which humanity we will belong after adolescence to. Probably there are some genetic predispositions, since even cursory observation shows that in some families there are more people belonging to one or the other type of humanity. But genetic predisposition is not decisive. The decisive factor is the acquired during childhood anxiety, emotional intelligence. If the accumulated anxiety emotional intelligence is high enough by the adolescence, then the consciousness will emerge from the primary psychosis and will gain the subjectivity in shaping its anti-anxiety strategy. The primary psychosis will no longer protect the consciousness against the anxiety as it did throughout the childhood. From now on, using the achieved and constantly developing anxiety emotional intelligence, the consciousness will deal with anxiety on its own. But this subjectivity will cost a lot. Type 2 humanity, psychotic, can envy type 1 humanity, anxious emotional, almost everything. Type 2 humanity, that's the anxious emotional type, can envy type 1 humanity, psychotic, almost everything. The type 2 humanity, anxious emotional, envy the type 1 humanity, psychotic, the lack of self-criticism, a very high self-esteem, and the constant self-satisfaction, the absence of any remorse at all, a sense of infallibility, a sense of superiority, a shallow emotionality, rigid attitudes and views, task-oriented attitudes, the naivety and the childishness and no tendency to addictions. But of course, the most important thing that can be envied is the lack of the of the of the perception of anxiety. Yes, the consciousness of the type 1 humanity people, psychotic, is objectified by the state of primary psychosis. So it's not a subjective and free consciousness. But let's admit, what a sweet bondage. Meanwhile, the way out of the childhood psychosis, this way is possible only because our life turned out in such a way that we had the opportunity to acquire many mental skills useful for coping with the anxiety. And to acquire these skills, it was not an easy and comfortable life what made it possible, but on the contrary. And here again, the type 1 humanity, psychotic, can be envied that easy life does not end with the childhood. Someone could say, and what? That the type 1 humanity has an easier life than type 2 humanity. If the consciousness of the type 1 humanity is objectified by the primary psychosis, and the consciousness of the type 2 humanity is a sovereign subject of its psyche. It is true. But it's also true that the comfort of the psyche with the consciousness objectified by the psychosis is infinitely greater than the comfort of the psyche with the subjective consciousness. In the case of the carefree, objectified consciousness, the consciousness may focus on finding new and new pleasures. In the case of the subjective consciousness, there is no time to think about pleasures, because this consciousness must all the time face the anxiety and emotions on its own. So, the objectified consciousness is the carefree consciousness. It's busy with the looking for the life pleasures. It's the happy consciousness. The subject consciousness, on the other hand, is all the time occupied with experiencing anxiety and emotions, constantly busy with analyzing its situation in terms of the anxiety emotional alertness. This, unfortunately, is an unhappy, in the majority of the cases, consciousness. Hence, a simple conclusion. Being a type 2 humanity, for our own sake, we should try to move from the position of the anxious emotional psyche to the position of the primary psychosis psyche. But is it possible? Since we know how a person with the primary psychosis behaves, why should it be impossible to learn to behave like this? Thank you.